The summer of 1305 weighed heavy on Scotland. The wars of independence had raged for nearly a decade, and William Wallace, the outlaw knight turned rebel leader, had become the most hunted man in the British Isles. His victories at Stirling Bridge and his defiance of King Edward the Firm had carved his name into legend, but also painted a bloody target on his back. Wallace was not a crowned king, but his people called him Guardian of Scotland. His mere survival after defeat at Falkirk had kept hope alive. Yet betrayal, not battle, would bring him low. In August of that year, near Glasgow, he was seized, some say by a fellow Scot who sought favour with the English king. Bound in chains, Wallace was dragged southward. The journey from Scotland to London was a cruel parade of humiliation. Shackled on horseback, he was paraded through towns where English loyalists spat at him, cursed him, and hurled stones. For the English crown, displaying Wallace in chains was as important as the execution to come. His capture was meant to break the spirit of Scotland. When he reached London, the city buzzed with anticipation. News spread quickly that the great rebel would be tried at Westminster Hall. Crowds gathered in the streets, eager to glimpse the man whose name had long been whispered like a curse. For them, Wallace was not a hero but a traitor who dared defy the authority of Edward Longshanks. The trial itself was no trial at all. Wallace was dragged before the court in Westminster Hall, gaunt from captivity, yet still defiant. He was charged with treason against the King of England, though Wallace never swore fealty to Edward. Shackled, he answered with few words, refusing to admit guilt for rebellion he considered righteous. "Never was I Edward's subject," he reportedly declared, his voice echoing in the hall. But the verdict had been written long before he stood there. To the English, he was guilty. To Edward, he was a symbol that had to be destroyed, body and memory alike. The sentence pronounced was one reserved for the vilest of traitors, that William Wallace should be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The ritual was not merely execution, but a theatre of terror, designed to strip away humanity and turn death into a message. Wallace would endure every stage of it in front of a jeering crowd. On August 23, 1305, the morning of his execution dawned grey. Wallace was held in the Tower of London, chained and under heavy guard. Priests came to him, urging confession, but he refused to repent his cause. If he prayed, it was to Scotland, not to England's king. From the Tower, Wallace was dragged through the filthy streets of London. He was not carried with dignity, but tied to a wooden hurdle, his body scraping along the cobblestones. Horses pulled him slowly, ensuring that the crowd had time to jeer, spit, and pelt him with offal. This procession itself was the first act of torment. The people lined the streets in thousands. They shouted "traitor" and waved English banners. To them, it was a holiday, a spectacle of state power. Children clambered onto rooftops to watch, while vendors sold bread and ale. Wallace, bruised and bleeding, was displayed like a conquered beast, dragged to Smithfield where the gallows stood waiting. The air at Smithfield reeked of sweat, dung, and excitement. The gallows towered, ropes swaying in the breeze. Wallace was untied from the hurdle and forced upright. He was stripped nearly bare, his body exposed to the crowd's gaze. Executioners bound his hands tightly, preparing for the next stage. The hanging began, but unlike the clean drop of later centuries, Wallace was subjected to slow strangulation. The rope tightened around his neck, lifting him just enough to suffocate but not enough to kill. His face turned red, veins bulged, and his body writhed while the crowd roared approval. Just as death neared, the rope was cut. Wallace collapsed in the dirt, gasping for air. His chest heaved as life dragged back into him, but mercy was never the purpose. This was the drawing of the sentence, the revival meant to prolong agony. The executioners moved quickly, stripping him further for what came next. In front of the crowd, Wallace was stretched upon a wooden table. Knives were drawn, his belly was sliced open, and his entrails pulled slowly into the light of day. The executioners took care to prolong his torment, each movement deliberate, each scream fueling the crowd's frenzy. Some accounts claim his heart and lungs were cut while he still breathed, a mockery of his once thundering defiance. Others say he bore it silently, refusing his enemies the satisfaction of hearing him beg. Either way, The disembowelment was the most grotesque spectacle the English crown could offer. To increase humiliation, Wallace's severed entrails were burned before his eyes. The smoke curled into the summer sky as the crowd shouted its approval. To them, the rebel was being unmade piece by piece, his insides turned to ash as a warning to any who might rise in Scotland's name. The agony seemed endless, but the executioners were far from done. His body, barely alive, was prepared for the final stage, quartering. His limbs would not only be torn from him, but sent across the land, nailed to town gates as tokens of Edward's wrath. Scotland would see its hero reduced to fragments. As the afternoon sun bore down, Wallace's blood ran into the dirt of Smithfield. His face, once fierce, was gaunt and pale, but his legend had not dimmed. Even as his enemies sought to erase him through pain, the spectacle etched his defiance deeper into the memory of those who would tell his story. The crowd that had come for entertainment saw more than death. They witnessed cruelty refined into ritual. And though they cheered, though they called him traitor, whispers spread even then, that Wallace, in suffering so terribly, had become greater than before. The disembowelment had left Wallace broken in body, but not in symbol. His breath was ragged, blood soaked the ground beneath him, and his eyes glazed with pain. Yet still he lived, and the executioners knew they must complete the spectacle exactly as ordered. Edward's justice demanded no half measures. The command was given, and the executioners brought out the broad axe. The crowd hushed for a moment, their drunken cheers fading into anticipation. This was the climax of traitors' deaths, the quartering, the division of the body into 4 pieces, each destined for display across the realm. Wallace, barely conscious, was bound again. His limbs were stretched outward, his body secured to a wooden block. The executioners worked with practiced precision, for they had done this before. Still, the brutality of the act turned even some onlookers pale. But duty and the king's vengeance left no space for pity. The axe rose and fell. Flesh split, bone cracked, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Wallace's left arm was severed, lifted into the air for all to see. Blood sprayed across the executioner's apron, and the smell of iron hung heavy in the August air. The first piece of Scotland's champion had been claimed. Then came the second blow, and his right arm was hacked away. Each cut was not just execution, but theatre. Each limb turned into a message. The crowd roared, but among them were quiet faces. Men and women who had admired his defiance, now forced to watch their hero reduced to fragments. The legs followed, first the left, then the right, each blow echoing across the square. Wallace's body was dismembered in front of thousands, his humanity stripped piece by piece. To the English, it was justice. To the Scots who would hear the tale, it was martyrdom. When the quartering was done, the remains of William Wallace no longer resembled the man who had once rallied armies. What lay on the block was unrecognizable, a carcass dismantled for political theatre. Yet the execution was not complete. There was still his head, the greatest prize of all. The executioners lifted his head from his shoulders with one final stroke. Blood poured down the wooden block, staining it dark. The head was raised aloft, shown to the cheering crowd as the ultimate token of victory. Edward had demanded it, and his people reveled in the triumph. But the punishment did not end in Smithfield. Each part of Wallace's body had a destination. His head, tarred to preserve it from decay, was set aside for London Bridge. There it would be mounted on a pike, so that all who entered the city would see the fate of traitors. The quarters were packed for transport. His left arm was sent to Newcastle, a warning to the borderlands. His right arm went to Berwick, the contested town that had changed hands so many times between England and Scotland. Each piece was meant to whisper terror into those who dared resist. The legs travelled north as well. One was dispatched to Perth, a Scottish stronghold, while the other went to Aberdeen. There, nailed above gates and walls, they were to rot under the sky, a daily reminder that resistance would end in mutilation. Edward's justice stretched across the map like a blood-stained banner. The spectacle of Wallace's death lingered in the minds of those who saw it. Many Englishmen celebrated, believing rebellion had been broken forever. But for others, merchants, travellers, soldiers who had fought in Scotland, there was unease. Rarely had even the worst traitors been subjected to such meticulous cruelty. At London Bridge, his head was displayed almost immediately. Blackened with tar, it leered down at all who entered the city. Merchants crossing into London paused to look, children pointed, and guards laughed as they explained whose head it was. William Wallace, once guardian of Scotland, now reduced to a trophy. Yet even in death, the sight carried power. Some whispered prayers beneath their breath as they passed the bridge, murmuring his name in defiance of the king's intent. Others spread the tale northward, telling of Wallace's courage in facing execution, of his silence under torment, of his refusal to bend the knee. In Scotland, the arrival of his quartered remains struck like thunder. In Aberdeen, villagers gathered beneath the gates to stare at the mutilated limb nailed above them. Some spat at it, fearful of English reprisal if they showed sorrow. Others wept quietly, seeing not a piece of flesh but a piece of their freedom torn away. At Perth, the same grim ritual played out. His quarter, dangling above the town, became a site of dark pilgrimage. Farmers, soldiers, and priests looked upon it and swore vengeance in hushed voices. The English had meant to end Wallace's legend by scattering his body, but in scattering they had spread his memory. The dismemberment of Wallace was not only an execution, but a declaration of war. Edward I wanted Scotland crushed, its people cowed into submission. Yet Wallace's fate hardened resistance instead. His body was gone, but his story carried farther with each limb nailed to a gate, and each whisper passed in the night. Even the English chroniclers, though loyal to their king, recorded the spectacle with unease. They described the execution in detail, acknowledging the brutality, but insisting it was just punishment. Still, behind the words lingered the recognition that Wallace's suffering had already passed into legend. The quartering marked the end of William Wallace's body, but not his presence. In taverns, in farms, in secret halls across Scotland, his name was spoken as though he were still alive. Mothers told their children of his courage, priests spoke of his sacrifice, and soldiers remembered the fire he once lit. By nightfall, London returned to its usual rhythm, its people content that justice had been served. Yet the image of Wallace's mangled body remained in the minds of all who had gathered at Smithfield. The executioners washed the blood from the block, but the ground itself seemed stained forever. The quartering was complete, but Edward's lesson did not land as intended. The body of Wallace had been broken, but the spirit of rebellion was only sharpening. For even as his limbs rotted on English gates and Scottish walls, the idea of freedom had found a martyr. The summer heat gave way to autumn, but the memory of Wallace's execution lingered like smoke across England and Scotland alike. In London, his head still loomed from the spike on London Bridge, the tar keeping it black and stiff, birds pecking at what remained. Each passerby was forced to look upon the rebel's face, distorted but still recognizable. Travellers carried the tale north. They spoke of the dragging through London, the slow hanging, the disembowelment, the quartering, and the head lifted high. Though Edward had meant to crush rebellion, every retelling fanned the embers. The brutality itself turned Wallace from outlaw into something larger, into a martyr. In the villages of Scotland, whispers grew louder. Farmers looked upon the quarter nailed to the gates of Aberdeen and muttered that Edward feared Wallace even in death. In Perth, where another limb hung, townsfolk swore vengeance beneath their breath. The English banners above the gates fluttered, but so too did Scottish hearts refusing to yield. Priests began to weave his name into sermons. They did not call openly for revolt, but they spoke of sacrifice, of the price of freedom, of men who gave their bodies for their people. In hushed voices after Mass, the faithful whispered Wallace's name, as though invoking a saint who had bled for Scotland. Edward Longshanks believed terror could bind the land. Yet the cruelty of Wallace's death showed Scotland the measure of the English king. His people saw that mercy would never come from London. The only path forward was defiance, and the memory of Wallace gave that defiance a face. Even among the English, unease stirred. Merchants who travelled north saw how the Scots spoke of Wallace with reverence, how children knew his name, how rebels carried his spirit into the hills. Some whispered that Edward had made a mistake, that he had slain a man but birthed a legend. As winter came, Scotland's rebels regrouped. Robert the Bruce, once hesitant, began to move with greater resolve. The shadow of Wallace lingered at his side. Those who had fought under Wallace's command remembered his fire, and carried it into new battles. His execution had not ended the war. It had lit its second stage. The fragments of Wallace's body rotted on English and Scottish walls, but his story grew fresher with each season. Around hearths, parents told their children of the great warrior who had defied the English king, who had fought for Scotland when others knelt, who had endured horrors without surrender. The brutality of his end became the proof of his greatness. Common men who had never met him now spoke of him as if they had marched at his side. To them, Wallace was not simply a man, but the embodiment of defiance. His death was not the closing of a chapter, but the opening of a cause. In London, Edward's court boasted of the execution. Chroniclers recorded every detail, intending it to stand as a warning through the ages, yet even their words betrayed unease. Some described Wallace as fierce, others as courageous, acknowledging him as a worthy enemy. The attempt to degrade him only gilded his memory. Time passed, but the vision of Wallace's death refused to fade. His head on London Bridge became a landmark, pointed out by guards to travellers, yet also mourned silently by Scots who passed beneath it. His body had been scattered, but his story united. The king had divided his flesh but could not divide his name. When Robert the Bruce declared himself King of Scots in 1306, Wallace's ghost seemed to ride beside him. His death had become the soil in which rebellion grew. Men who had once despaired at Falkirk now remembered Smithfield, not with fear, but with rage. Wallace's executioners had planted the seeds of their own defeat. The wars raged on. Battles were lost, battles were won, but Wallace remained ever present. Songs were sung of him in taverns, carried from mouth to mouth, until even peasants who had never seen his face knew his story. His courage became a lesson, his torment a rallying cry. Decades later, when Bannockburn shook the earth and Scotland's armies triumphed, men claimed they fought in the shadow of Wallace. His sacrifice had not been in vain. The English king who sought to erase him had instead ensured that every Scottish victory to come would bear his name. The image of his death endured beyond the battlefield. Artists, scribes, and poets retold the tale, painting Wallace as both warrior and martyr. His quartered body became the symbol of a nation itself torn apart, yet destined to reassemble. His head upon London Bridge became the crown of a man who never wore one. Generations later, Scots would still speak his name with reverence. Parents told their children of his stand at Stirling, of his courage at Falkirk, of his silence under torture. They told how the English king had feared him so greatly that he tore him limb from limb, and how even that could not silence him. Wallace's execution was meant to frighten Scotland into obedience. Instead, it ensured that no Scot could forget him. His body had been destroyed, but his spirit had been forged into the nation's identity. England had created not a warning, but a symbol too powerful to kill. At Smithfield, where the dirt still held the memory of his blood, the ground itself seemed haunted. Centuries later, Londoners would still recall the day when thousands gathered to watch the rebel's death, unaware that they were witnessing the making of a legend that no axe could erase. Wallace was gone, but his presence endured. His defiance, his agony, his dismemberment, all became part of the story Scotland carried in its bones. The rebel had become immortal, not in flesh, but in the fire he left behind.